So, like Jonathan mentioned before, if we run out of Nicaea-related questions, it could be free for all. But well, there's no buts. It just is. That's what I do all week, so I can't complain. So I'll take your questions now.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So the Filioque that's added after it's actually kind of early to mid 11th century is when that's added, and it kind of redefines the Holy Spirit, and obviously that causes the 1054 split. Because of so much of what we've already been talking about and sharing with us is that there's attitude and language as a real problem with even trying to come to terms on commonality of the members of the Godhead. Is the Filioque just one more thing on top of something that was insurmountable, since we've already talked about the consubstantial aspects? Or is it just sort of like that's the big point, or is it just one more on top of a whole mound of points?
I think it's one more that some people would say was unnecessary. I don't know if it's purely a language matter. Of course, they add language. The West does, and saying, and the Son, as far as the sending of the Spirit. There's all sorts of things they would argue. Textually, they'd argue, and I forget the verses, but one's in John 20, but there's a stronger one in John 15, and I just can't locate the exact address off the top of my head, but where Jesus actually does say that he also sends the Spirit. So there is textual grounding for it. Part of the problem there is that the East knows that the West is also tying this to eternal generation. However, there are people in the East that believe in eternal generation and would defend the same thing. But that part, you could say, is speculative. Now, where does that come from? A little bit Hilary and a lot Augustine. In Augustine's work on the Trinity, the whole second half of the book, he develops all these analogies for the Trinity. And so there's all these ways in which he's trying to explain, part of what he's trying to explain is ways that the Spirit could be sent within the Godhead. You could point to those verses and make a good case biblically for how he's sent in the missions, in redemption, because you have those two verses, if nothing else. And you could argue, well, if they would have just stuck with that, or what's the big deal to begin with? You could just say, that could be good theology, but why do you need to put it in the creed if it's going to divide the empire? One more side argument, maybe both sides can make this. It's kind of an Edward Gibbon type statement. It could be cynical. There was probably political motivation anyway. The Pope already wanted to excommunicate the East, and I think it happened on Christmas Eve of 1054. So it's like, Merry Christmas, excommunicate. But there was political reasons anyway that the East and West wanted to divide. Each one was vying for. By the way, it's one of the huge arguments against Roman Catholicism, that's a late development. Even as late as the 11th century, you had Constantinople versus Rome. In the centuries before that, just 5 centuries at the most before that, you had Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch. You could argue Jerusalem, though it was ineffectual at that point, and Carthage. So that's one of the things you look at. But as far as what all of the motivations are, or what was the main motivation, it's they would say, the West would say, well, because we're right, because it's in the text. And, Augustine makes that argument, although it's not put in there when Augustine was writing that, it's put in there later. Anselm makes the argument in a separate, I believe, a whole separate essay defending the Filioque Clause. And so that's written just 40 years after the split. So that might be the best. And I read it a long time ago, so I don't remember what he said, to be honest with you. But that might be the best place to read what the best argument for it would be. Yeah. Yep.
Mind doing a quick rundown on what eternal generation is?
Yeah, I'll give you 30 seconds. I'll give you the 10 second. This is one of those things that's not difficult to say, but then once you say it, everybody's like, now what does that mean? Then you got a problem. But the first thing to know about it is also equally hard to explain. And that is that among the classical theologians, especially see this in Aquinas, there was what was called the negative way, the via negativa of doing theology. You could speak about God by what he is not. And so when you so somebody asks you, what's the difference between the three persons? What do you mean by person? And Augustine would say, and this is an overstatement at first, and he's very much misinterpreted when he says this, we say persons so that we're not reduced to silence. Because we got to say something. Well, that's not all Augustine said, and it's not quite what he meant by it. Instead, what they'll refer to is what the classical theologians would call a relation of origin. And already that blows your mind because, whoa, origin, what do you mean? That's Arianism, because the Son didn't originate. So everything I'm about to say, wipe from your mind the earthly version of that. Most obviously, the Son. Was the Son born? Sure he was. Mary, in his human nature. Well, that's true. And that's what we want to say to the Muslim. That's what we want to say, people that are misunderstanding that. But eternal generation, as well as the eternal procession of the Holy Spirit, is referring to three attributes of what is proper to the persons. The paternity of the Father, the filiation of the Son, and the spiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, they will also say that we know of these things in eternity by the way that they are expressed in redemption, in the works of redemption. So, what do you mean spiration? Well, we do know what that means. Jesus breathes on. Now, right away, I'm cheating. So the Father breathes in eternity? No. So that's where you have to deal with analogical language. And you have to settle for a point where you realize that reason is hit the wall and can say that in some way the Son is related to the Father as a Son and the Father is related to the Son as a Father. But at that point, all that we can say, and there's things we can say, but the things that we can rule out, that via negativa. So he was not created. There was not a time sequence. And I'll say a lot about this when we get to that expression, light from light. By the way, early clue, is there a verse that teaches something like eternal generation? Some people will argue there's several, but I would suggest Hebrews 1:3 is a clear one. That expression, light from light, do they get that from the Bible? I think they do. He's the radiance of, right? What's radiance? It's light from light. It's one way to say it. And there's all sorts of it. Well, I think Augustine had some good analogies on that. And analogies break down. So you'll light from a light source from the sun. That analogy breaks down because that light, there's a speed of light and all that stuff. And that light, that energy burns out. So there's all sorts of ways that the analogy breaks down. But you start to build up an idea of what these relations of origin, what they mean by way of analogy and negation. Is that helpful? At first, we're scratching the surface here.
And the key word is eternal.
Yeah. It's like when you're talking to them. Yeah, when you're talking to a Muslim and they say, God can't have a son, they mean God can't give birth. They have a carnal understanding of that. Which is not to say we have a much better understanding because we know what it means. Well, we don't know what it means in that sense, but we know quite a few things that it doesn't mean, that it can't mean. And in that, we can start to see some positive things too about light and other attributes of God that he's always had. And communicating this without falling into subordinationism is one of the big tricks, one of the big difficult exercises in the history of theology. But I would say Augustine's book on the Trinity is worth spending a season. It'll take you a season to get through. that ruined all other questions.
Well, we can save some for next week.
Yeah, sounds good.